Okay, welcome everyone to session 2, workshop number 5, Teach This, Not That, Disrupting Texts in the Secondary Classroom. We are joined today by Tricia Ebarvia and Kim Parker. Take it away.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here this morning, or I guess it's afternoon now. Tricia Ebarvia, and I am a high school English teacher just outside of the Philadelphia area. I've been teaching since 2001, same school, so it's definitely been a good experience, although also limiting, I'm sure. Kim has moved around a little bit more frequently, has a little bit more world experience than me. So Kim, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hey, I am Kim Parker. I am currently the assistant director of the Shady Hill Teacher Training Program in Cambridge, Mass. Before that, have taught about 17 years in all kinds of different environments, urban, suburban, well-resourced, under-resourced. And we are both Heinemann Fellows.
Yes. Kim and I met about this time 2 years ago. It's our almost 2-year anniversary, Kim, and through the Heinemann Fellows program. And those of you who saw the opening today with Ellen Keene, who is our chairperson, whom we love. Hello, Ellen. I have to go back and watch her session. It has been an amazing opportunity to be part of that group. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today has come out of the work and both formal and informal, the conversations we've had with our fellows. So shout out to all the fellows. Our time is coming to its end, but I do not accept that.
I know, I refuse.
Okay. So I'll share my screen now. Here we go. And then get here. Here we go. And can you see the presentation yet? Do you see that? Yes?
I see it.
Okay. All right. Good. So today we are talking Teach This, Not That, as Diana mentioned, disrupting text in the secondary classroom. And we told you a little bit who we are. And you can see there on the bottom of almost every slide, there is the hashtag for this particular session. And those are our Twitter handles, Teach Kim Possible and Tricia Ebarvia. So today we're going to talk a little bit about bias. And what do you mean by bias? This is the Google definition that if you just Google it, you'll see it's, prejudice in favor or against someone or something or some idea. It is, often showing favoritism for something or against something. But we're here to talk about too is about the way bias appears in all different forms. The next slide here, I want to share with you, we all have biases. It's just naturally who we are. If you think about our environments and all the stimuli that come at us, our brain takes shortcuts in order to process all of it. And I love this resource. I actually have this poster hanging up in my classroom, and it goes over 24 cognitive biases. And again, these are really shortcuts that we use in our thinking, but they include things like anchoring, which is where the first thing that we learn or the first piece of information that influences everything else that follows. Confirmation bias, of course, seeking information that validates our point of view. In-group bias, where we favor those in our group. Framing, how something is delivered, the context influences the way that we judge anything that might follow it. And again, I do use this in the classroom, and my students, in fact, about a month ago, we used it, and we talked a little bit about how these are appearing in our own thinking. Let me move forward here. Okay, and so when we think about bias and we think about identity, we're really looking at the people, experiences, and backgrounds, the cultures and the contexts that inform our biases and therefore who we are and how we see the world, right? Identity is who we are, how we see the world, and how we treat others. Just recently, thinking about the environment, just recently I listened to a great Hidden Brain podcast. And I'm going to stop sharing this slide for a second. A great Hidden Brain podcast. And if you're not familiar with it, I definitely recommend it. Can you see me or can you see the slides?
I can see you, Tricia.
Okay, you can see me. Okay, well, I can't see me now, so hopefully I look fine. But I listened to the Hidden Brain podcast, and what they found was, if you're familiar with Harvard University's implicit bias test, it's one that you can take online, and if you Google it, you can find it. That is open to the public to take, and it tests your biases in all different avenues and venues of life and public, the public domain, and what they found was that there was a correlation between police shootings, the number of police shootings of unarmed Black men, and implicit bias. So the higher the score of the implicit bias in a region, they could predict a higher rate of police shootings. And what's interesting that they pointed out about that research is that the police weren't necessarily the ones who were actually taking that test, right? It was the people that were around them. So it's interesting to think about how, excuse me, the community that you surround yourself in, the air that you breathe, even if you yourself individually don't think of yourself as a biased person or prejudiced, you are influenced by the people who are around you. And we saw that most recently with the Starbucks incident. So Kim, if you want to talk a little bit about that.
And Tricia, I was just checking social media, so sorry, okay. I was not laughing at bias. I was laughing at like Ellen Key and Halen. But I think it's really interesting to think about how the Starbucks Philadelphia incident is playing out, right? Like these two gentlemen were in a place that, and Philly has a high population of people of color, but in that particular space, right, in Rittenhouse Square, they were perceived as different. And with all of the rhetoric sort of going on about Starbucks and about how welcoming it was, all of these biases came into place because they didn't look like they belonged. And I think in terms of thinking about how do we sort of reconcile text with what's happening, this is a perfect opportunity. And I hope one that we're talking about with young people, because here it is writ large, right? These are our biases on display. What do we do with them?
Yeah, good. Yeah. So, and I'm actually from the Philly area, and you're right. It's the Rittenhouse area is a definite swanky area, I should say. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So, can you see the slide now? Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So the other thing that we want to think about, if we are thinking about ourselves and our identity, is these three questions here. So thinking about the inclusivity of the media that you consume. And I think what's important here is that it's both personal consumption and professional consumption. So what do you read personally by people of color, LGBTQIA+ authors, writers with disabilities, what books, news articles, publications? Sometimes I think as teachers, it would be nice if there was this maybe perhaps dividing line between our teacher selves and our private, selves and work-life balance and everything. But the truth is that we teach who we are and we bring everything that we are into the classroom, the examples that we use, the analogies we use, the experiences we share. And our experiences are informed by what the media we consume, whether it's TV, films, podcasts, who's creating that media, what visions of the world are they sharing? And Kim, do you want to talk a little bit about the professional literature and PD?
Sure. I think it's really, we can get really caught up in sort of continuing to cite and to use voices of sort of big names or people who might also be sort of reviewed in the literature. And so I think we have to work really hard to first say who's in my, what articles am I reading, who's workshops am I going to see, who's missing, right? And then we need to work to diversify those personal learning networks and also our PD, because if we are consistently seeing the same people talking about the same thing, then that tells us something, right? There are plenty of people, underrepresented populations who are excellent PD providers, and we're not necessarily using them. And so what does that say if we like PD, but we only like our PD from certain people? And also we like personal learning networks, but only if they include people who look like us or who share the same values. So again, it's thinking about who's in our network, who's missing, and what are we going to do about it? Because if we're not changing it, then it doesn't really matter.
Yep. Okay. Then we'll move to our next screen share. Whoops. I'm still getting a hang of this. Sorry.
You got it, Tricia.
I got it. I got it. It's going to be good. All right.
You got
Share. All right. And here we go. Okay. So those 3 questions that we were on the previous slide, they're actually part of a larger, more extended tool. And this tool is something that I created that came out of the work with Heinemann about how inclusive your literacy classroom is really. And it consists of 8 questions. We just went over the first one and the 3 sub-questions. But it's really about, there's the media that you consume, but there's also, how inclusive is your curriculum, right? And we're going to get to some of that today. And then also how inclusive is your classroom library, your mentor text for writing, how often you use gendered versus non-gendered language, how equitable are your classroom discussions, how often do you model inclusive thinking when discussing your responses to texts? As a teacher, do you showcase or at least reveal some of your own struggles and the opportunities for learning that you've embraced, and maybe you can model that for your students? And in what ways do you regularly revisit your curriculum with your colleagues and think about how inclusive your practices are? If you can see, are you seeing the screen right now? Yes. You can see there's a link to that, how inclusive, the bit.ly link to both that blog post and to the tool right there. Kim, do you want to add anything here about the tool?
Yeah, I just want to say that I've used this tool since Tricia created it with pre-service teachers, with teachers at all stages of their teaching careers. And this has been one of the most powerful tools that we can use for self-reflection. So I can't encourage folks to use the whole thing enough, all 8 questions, but definitely to start with these and then work your way out, giving yourself plenty of time to really work through and to really think about what you were doing and what you are consuming, because it does really start the work of self-reflection in ways that can change your practice.
Yes. And as we think about self-reflection, we're reminded of Donalyn Miller's work. And Kim, can you speak to this?
Oh my goodness, right? Donalyn. I think she says it a couple of times, but essentially she's talking about don't let our blind spots be your weaknesses. All right, what are we missing? Who's not represented? What are we not reading intentionally? And what does that say about what we make accessible to children and young people, and about how we teach that material? And so, Tricia, you talked a lot about how we always need to be constantly vigilant, constantly learning to change those blind spots. Because, I think that for me, it's like an everyday process that I'm learning that, oh, that's another blind spot. Let me do something about it. Because you got to be like constantly on it. Otherwise, I don't know, it's just a process.
Yeah. I think for me, like even just recently, when I think about inclusivity, I've often thought about the text that we read and that we choose, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But even just a few months ago, when I was preparing a presentation for NCTE, I was looking up some mentor texts for writing, and what I realized was that I was going to my old tried and true standbys, the things that were in my anthologies, the things that I had been using for years, who are great writers, people like David Sedaris and Anna Quinlan, but I wasn't going beyond them, and that was a blind spot for myself. I had been working on the reading and making sure my classroom library was diverse, but I hadn't gone to writing. And I thought, well, what does that mean that I'm not sharing and I'm not modeling and showing kids different types of writers, diverse writers who are writing about different topics for one thing, but also different styles? What does that mean that I'm not doing that? So, and again, that was just a few months ago that I realized I had that own blind spot in my own teaching.
But Tricia, I think it was also really powerful because then, and I think you challenged other people in your session to use all mentor texts by people of color.
Right.
Because you said, and I think that, yeah, they're there. They're there. Surprise! They were there the whole time. And I just think that it can be done. And it's so much of what we're talking about today is really a mind shift to thinking about, how do I do the work? It's like, it's not impossible. And as teachers of color, we've been doing the work for a long time. And so what might it take to then make the change?
Right. Okay. All right. And we'll go. So what does this mean? And what does this look like in terms of bias in our classrooms? And go there next. Let's see, share. Am I sharing this? Yes, I'm screen sharing now. Okay. All right. So what does this look like in our classrooms as far as our biases are concerned? It might look like a couple different things here. So first, it looks like curriculum that doesn't change, right? I mean, we love our comfort zones. I think as teachers, one interesting thing is that we are asked to be vulnerable in front of our students every single day. And so people who talk about accountability, they don't understand how you are accountable every single day to a room full of teenagers. And that's the only accountability that really, really matters. But I think that we get into these comfort zones. We get into a rhythm where we can almost predict the questions that kids are going to ask, and we've got the answer, and we feel safe there, and we're really moving along. But I think the problem with that is that we get too comfortable. So we don't change the curriculum because this is what we know. And this is what I know works. And I know exactly the moment in the text to introduce this question. And that's expertise, and that's fantastic. But I think it can also, again, keep us from seeing what else is out there. And this, of course, lines up with another bias, which is the sunk cost fallacy. We've already put this much time and energy into creating this curricula. Now you want me to change it. But if we're going to be responsive to the kids sitting in our classrooms, we have to think about that. And then also, what might it look like? It might look like teachers who are choosing based really on their own prior experiences. Another bias, a cognitive bias out there, is availability heuristic, where we tend to think about the things that first come to mind, was easily available. And that example that I gave about those mentor texts for writing, what sprung to my mind were the things that were immediately available to me because I was in the habit of using certain people, certain texts all the time. And so we have to always think about how those biases may be working and creeping into our instruction. Kim, do you want to talk about too hard and too easy texts?
Sure. I think teachers can also fall into the pit of thinking that some texts are just too hard for some groups of students to read. I think that often falls to underserved young people, that we don't give them full text, or we give them, we might not give them the same text as those taught on an advanced or an honors level, because they just won't finish the reading, or they just won't do what we need them to do. And I think that, I don't know, right? Like, we've been underestimating underserved kids forever, and that is just not working. So they can do more. We have excellent examples of people who are doing the work with them in ways that are powerful. And then also, on the other hand, we give them texts that are too easy, because then we don't want them to fail, or we are afraid of not being able to provide the supports for them. And so it just ends up being more in that land of bias, where we don't give kids what they need.
Yeah.
And Tricia, talk about, go ahead.
I was going to talk about the last bullet point. Did you have something else?
Go ahead.
Okay. So it was the last thing that that came to our mind was this idea of silences. The bias also appears in the curriculum through what we don't do and what we don't say. If, again, thinking about classroom libraries, what are the books that you showcase for kids? And we don't think twice when we see a YA romance and it's a boy and a girl who are on the cover, but the minute you think about, or you ask teachers to think about maybe putting the, Two Boys Kissing by David Levithan, then there's like, well, I don't know if I should put that up there or not. But think about the kids in your classroom, the kids who don't identify with, like heteronormative behavior. Like this is something that we have to think about when we think about the writers that we introduce. I was thinking about how I was telling Kim before, how we always talk about like, oh, well, we're going to now read this, Black American writer, but do we say white American writer? And, or do we say now we're going to do a unit of female writers? Like it's this constant. In what ways are we using our silences and our labels to other as well, right?
Right. Okay.
The next slide here, we'll go back to here. There's something great that Kim has recently been using. And if you're not familiar with it, we definitely recommend it. We don't have time to necessarily go through all of it here. Sharing screen. Okay. Can you see that now? Yep. Mm-hmm. Okay. So Kim, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
I think so we use it as a framework of thinking about how do you then sort of lay this onto the 8 questions that Tricia set up. And so once you've sort of entered the conversation about thinking about our own biases, then how do we then apply it to the curriculum? So this is by Sadker, and we've put the link up because I think that it does require some time to sort of work your way through it. But we're going to, I think, Tricia, right, we're going to work through maybe one of these. But thinking about the 7 forms: exclusion of various groups, stereotyping, single perspective, ignoring racism, discrimination, et cetera, are all ways that bias does show up in our curriculum.
And so when we think about text selection, so it's that first question about invisibility. So how inclusive or exclusive is your curriculum? And so how do you select and approach text? Again, we talked before about the way that curriculum might be shaped, not necessarily by like outsiders, but by ourselves, and how we choose based on our own experiences. Kim and I were both undergraduate English majors, and I know, and we've talked about this, how our background has been very canonical, right? And that we have both bought into, or we've been invested in what the traditional canon is, what it means to be literate, what it means to be cultured. But is that, I mean, I think about how, college is getting further and further away from me. And so when we think about, we're preparing kids for college, and we mean well, but again, our experiences are different than our kids' experiences are. And Kim, do you want to talk a little bit about the voices centered in the text?
Yeah. And, as Tricia and I were chatting this morning, I said, Tricia, right, I wasn't born woke. And I think that what is really interesting too, and that, we are all swimming in the water of white supremacy, is that I had internalized it too. And I had not, I'm from a family where we, we center literacy, and it's a very, it's a literacy that's centered on the Black experience, but it wasn't what I was teaching when I first started teaching. And I think that it's only in the last 10 years really that I've started to turn the corner to think about what does it mean to center the experiences of people of color and other underrepresented populations in my curriculum and with the teachers with whom I work. And that has changed everything, because it's also thinking about how do you use the text in ways that help young people enter conversations, to think about making change, and to really make the necessary progress that you can't do if you're just centering white narratives, for lack of a better expression.
Yeah. Kim, you made a note this morning that you wanted to talk about the racial literacy roundtables. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. Because one of the, I'm trying to find the slide. Oh, okay. So on that slide, one of them is about how do you, integrate cultural and racial literacy in your instruction. And I just want to shout out Yolanda Seeley Ruiz's work at Teachers College, who she hosts the racial literacy roundtables. And it's really a way of thinking about race as a structural problem. And I think that one way young people get really tripped up is thinking about it's more of race as an individual problem instead of seeing it as a structural problem. And if we are approaching text as ways of thinking about how do we help young folks think about race in ways that can confront it as structural inequalities, then that changes the conversation. Here too, I think it's really important, if you don't understand structural racism, to see and all work is really great. We use text to do work of really dismantling racism.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And as we're moving on a little bit here, one way to think about text selection is a course that everyone, of course, every high school has in the country, really, which is American literature, and thinking about the canon. And right. I think one of the arguments about the canon, and like we mentioned earlier, Kim and I, we are very invested in the quote unquote canon because, is what we know, right? So there's that bias there. But there is a value to shared cultural knowledge. There's no mistaking that this is true. That what binds us as people are the things that we read and that we share, and the texts we consume and we talk about. But we have to also think about in what ways that canon can be problematic, like who's creating it and for what reason. And that the canon, I've talked to my colleagues at school a lot about this, is not something that is static, right? It is something that canon should be ever changing. And when we think about American literature and the canon, and I have a slide up here, you know, then and now. So, I mean, I went to high school, it's now decades ago. And many of these books were the books that I read. And many of these books are the books that we still teach. And there's value in that, but there's also a question about that as well, right? Kim, would you say your experience is the same?
Same.
And again, it's not that there's anything wrong with these, but it's how are we teaching them, one, and two, do they still need to be taught, one, in the same way, and two, just in general? Could we perhaps, if we look at the next slide, offer some other narratives, right? So To Kill a Mockingbird is To Kill a Mockingbird, it's in the news so much, and but if we're talking about a narrative about a young person coming of age, having to face discrimination and racism, is that the only text? Are there other narratives? So we think about The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas, All American Boys, and Dear Martin. I mean, these are texts that also help to center not just the experience of looking at racism, but looking at it through particular characters' eyes. Kim, I know you had a lot to say about this earlier in terms of the well-developed characters.
Okay, I think. Let me remember. I think what I said is that young people need to be exposed to a range of well-developed characters of all varieties. And I think what we have to move away from, because it buys something and we're not doing critical work with it in terms of race difference or just being, then so the text that it's got to be a range of characters doing a range of things, like the everyday experiences, I think, that Violet Harris and Nair talk about, right? Like, we need the everyday as much as we need historical oppression or current day oppression.
Yes. Go through here. Okay, and all right, so we have these texts here as we shared, and then we'll move to the next slide. Of course, you can't, I mean, it would be one thing. I mean, we're not saying here that we need to get rid of things from the quote unquote past and from the traditional canon, but we are thinking about, you know, what should we keep, and we should keep things, and how can we think about what's worth keeping? Because we don't have these unlimited budgets where we can just get new books all the time. So what's worth keeping, and how do we know? So some things maybe to consider in thinking about what to keep. We might think about texts that engage students, and really in order to engage kids, we have to know them. We have to know what our kids need and want and are thinking about what issues are important to them. We've had lots of discussions about this idea, again, of rigor, and that, you know, Kylene Beers has said in the past, you know, rigor isn't inherent in any text, is not inherent in any particular text. Rigor is what you do with a text. Right. So any text can be rigorous, and creating conditions for engagement. Kim, I know you were saying earlier about, you know, we ask students of color to do all sorts of work in terms of engaging with a text.
Right, and then we're quick to say they're not engaging. And I think that this is where, if we are really worth our salt as teachers, right, we create those conditions. And I think that we ask underserved young people to do so much work, and we don't do it, like, we don't do it. Oh, but what I mean by that is that, what would it mean for us to center experiences of underrepresented populations for all children, right? White ones, and underserved young people as well. And then to think about what might it mean for everyone to be able to enter this text and to have a robust experience with it.
Yep. And again, back to that cultural literacy value. We might keep a text because I do think that there is value, of course, in reading some of those texts that we had there before, including To Kill a Mockingbird. But the question is, how do we get kids to talk about it? Or The Scarlet Letter, or, Their Eyes Were Watching Gods. But how do we engage with them? And how do we make explicit, rather than keep silent, the inherent biases that the writers had when they wrote these texts too? And what opportunities for disruption can there be? And so that is here. We can disrupt via pairings and counter narratives. So if we take a text like The Great Gatsby, what's interesting, or what I've been thinking more about, is how Gatsby, even kids who spark noted it back in the day, or you ask anyone and they will tell you The Great Gatsby is a great American novel. American Dream, Green Light, Daisy, like it's the iconic text. And yet, it is a very particular American dream that is represented in there. And that Fitzgerald is a very, he's like the 1%er, of American writers. And it's this one sliver of, it's not even New York. It's a very specific part of New York and New Yorkers. Making that conversation and that questioning explicit for kids, rather than just saying, oh, this is a great American novel, and letting that stand. Kim, can you talk about these counter narratives or pairings that we could use with The Great Gatsby?
Sure. And counter narratives are really given not just as really a way to think about recent what might have been taken for granted, notions of being taken for granted. And I think that what is interesting is The Danger of a Single Story by Chimamanda Adichie has essentially become like a canonical piece where we are asking ourselves sort of what single stories are we consuming, are we perpetuating, and what is the impact of that? In terms of thinking about the American dream, whatever that means, The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. That's a fantastic book because it helps, it's nonfiction, and it really helps readers think about what is the impact of the Great Migration. And it follows different families and folks as they move from the South to the North. And what is the cost, right? I think that, again, if we're thinking about racial literacy, it gives readers a way of thinking about structures that are either created or perpetuated, and the impact of those decisions. And it's really easy to extrapolate, think about how much of this is now still in existence. And I think that that's where, because we're dealing with young people, right? And they're rooted in today, and they're now. And so how we might think is great literature and their lived reality.
Yep. Yes. And here are a few more.
And also in the Sun, which is plastic tech. Yes.
Kim, I'm on the slide now with the other text too.
Oh, okay. Yes. Yeah. So we kept thinking, right? So if we're really going to disrupt these ideas or these texts, right? How can we use a canonical text to have broader conversations, serious conversations about disrupting what we think about something? And this is the power of a really robust and rich text. And so Tricia has graciously put some images on the bottom of this slide. So the next slide, Tricia, I'm going to probably advance us just a little bit so we'll have time to think about it. The next slide, there's a really great link to think for even more resources about how do you disrupt what you might be given to have really important conversations with young people.
Yeah. I just want to talk really briefly and the listen. I'm just going to go back to the slide here. This book right here, When the Emperor Was Divine by Julia Otsuka, I think is really, it kind of flies under the radar. I reread it again recently. And when we think about history and we think about what does it mean to be American and the American dream, this is a book, if you're not familiar with it, it is about, it's historical fiction, but it's about Japanese internment. And when you look at the world around us today and you think about the way groups are being othered constantly in our media and in our news, and by politicians. You know, there's that cliche, but it's cliche because it's true. Like, if you don't know your history, we're doomed to repeat it. But this is a great book in terms of putting kids into this, the point of view of what would it be like. What does it mean when your citizenship and your allegiance and your loyalty is questioned? And then, you know, what is the American legacy of like something like Japanese internment? And how many people even really know what that was? I mean, you know, and this, again, those silences, if we're not talking about it with kids, then they don't ever really learn about it either. And again, this, and like we said earlier, we are not by any means experts. So even this list is a living document, and just as we think the canon should be living. So this, maybe months ago at this point, I asked for suggestions about diverse texts to include in American literature. And this list right here is really just is a product of that, and it's ever changing. So please, if you have things that you would, if you want to take a look at the list and tweet out even more suggestions, we would definitely appreciate it, and we can add them so that we can crowdsource and make all of our pairings and our curriculum better through our shared knowledge. Okay, so what's that?
Just to say that it's really important that we remind all and that we're doing the work together, because otherwise we're not going to do any movement. Go ahead, Tricia. Yeah,
no, sorry, you're like, there's like an echo, or you're cutting in and out a little bit for me, but now I hear you.
Great.
Yeah, so going back to this idea of blind spots, so thinking about, you know, we're looking at narratives and looking at the idea of a white savior narrative, which I think that if we think about To Kill a Mockingbird, a text like To Kill a Mockingbird, again, if that's a text that has to do with discrimination and racism, it's good to question, well, whose voice is being centered there, and in what ways, right? And I wonder about that sometimes, where we might think about, you know, Atticus, and like, well, if I can just be like Atticus, then it will be okay. But again, like Kim was mentioning, those structural racism and those other things that are not said can actually be misleading. And the patriarchal bias.
Also yes, and also those really flat Black characters, right?
Yes.
So I think that then leads us down this slippery slope of not really being able to give full life to characters of color. And then, I mean, again, if we're discussing this with young people and we don't really talk about that, and we don't provide them really rich examples of all kinds of people, but particularly ones who are often left out of our canons, if we're going to call them that, then that's a problem, because then we see sort of the everyday playing out of it is that so many people fail to see the humanity of people of color. Like, we're just trying to live out here, right? Really. And if we can't even get it in a book, then how are we going to have it in real life? And really, right? If we're teaching, then we need to address that.
Yeah, I will never forget. I think at ILA, the first and only time I've been to ILA was, I think it wasn't this past summer, the summer before. I was in Boston. And I remember Kwame Alexander was one of the keynote speakers. And what he was saying, what he was pointing out was that, you know, what are the, who are the images and characters and people that come to mind in the moment, right? That the mind of the adult, I think it was something, I'm misquoting him here, but it's like the mind of adult is formed in the imagination of a child. And to think about that, right? That we are in the process of actively helping to shape young people, help them shape their own thinking. And the work starts now, right? That we know, if psychologists know from bias research, that it begins now. And once you have a point of view that is, kind of established for you when you're younger, it is hard to let go of it. You know, it is, it's hard. And we have to think about modeling how, even we've tried to do in this talk. I used to think this, and now I think this because I learned something a little bit different, right? And modeling that kind of thinking for kids, it's important.
There's this, Tricia, do you see the question?
I do see the question.
I mean, do you want to talk about that? I feel like that's, what do you think?
Well, I think that the thing with the idea of a quote unquote liberal agenda, or I think our work as educators is about being inclusive, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it is about seeing the humanity in all kids, all people, period. And I think it's not about politics. It's not about whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or anything like that. It is really about, look, we're human beings and we have to see each other, right? And I mean, really see each other and see each other, all of our faults, but also, you know, and we have to be willing to let kids, give them space to talk, and not to impose our own beliefs necessarily, but to make opportunities to invite kids to ask hard questions of each other. Kim?
And Tricia is answering a question that we got.
I'm sorry.
Do you ever get pushback that you are pushing a liberal agenda? And here is where I think it's really great for allies to speak up, right? Like, white allies are and co-conspirators. I think we need to push it past allies to really be co-conspirators, because those people, the co-conspirators, can amplify, can introduce text, can support colleagues in ways that I, as a Black woman, simply cannot do. And I think that if you have a concerted response, I think that then you're more likely to be able to have these conversations. But I'm telling you, like, if you don't have them, then this is where I think white silence does equal violence. Like, we are dying, really, seriously. And so when it comes down to pushing some sort of agenda, I think I push back by saying, well, we know what's happening if we don't have these conversations, right? Like, it's our job. It's my responsibility. And if I'm not having them, then who else is?
Yeah. Yeah. Here, let's go back to, I don't know where we are. Sorry.
We're running out of time.
I know. I'm trying to get to the last couple slides. Don't worry. Okay, here we go. All right. We have 4 minutes left. Okay, we were talking about blind spots. Yeah, so I think, again, like, looking at some of these potential blind spots, and again, as Kim and I were going through these were things that came to our mind as far as our own blind spot. I think that last one, adultism especially, where we're so guilty of this idea of, like, knowing what's better for kids. And I think if you look around the world today especially, but all throughout history, think about how many times kids have been on the forefront of change, right? And that they have led that change. And that, yes.
And also kids are talking about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I cut you off.
And we need to have that space for them, right?
Right.
Yes. So here we go. And because Kim and I are huge fans of proponents of independent reading, we want to just throw in a slide here near the end. But don't forget about independent reading. Like, a lot of the things that we've talked about in this talk today is teacher actions, things that we as teachers need to do, that internal work. But really, the goal is handover, right? And the goal is to get kids to be doing the reading and doing the thinking and looking at their own biases in their reading and media consumption, and how they can tackle those things head on. Kim, you wanted to say something. You were reminded of Michelle, right?
Oh, yes. So here's where I want to give a shout out to my really great colleague, Michelle Lee, who reminded me, hold on, my note. She went to see Jackie Woodson, who said that really, I think it's either 75 or 80%, Jackie said, of our classroom library should feature people of color. So thinking about, it's not just enough to think about sort of what are the shared texts we read with young people, but what does our classroom library look like? And we need to do those audits in ways that make sure that we are featuring the windows, the mirrors, the sliding glass doors. And here too, I would be remiss if I did not remind us all to cite Rudine Sims Bishop, who gave us that term. I think lots of people are failing to give her the credit because we have that way of really being able to conceptualize our reading.
Yeah. And so now here we are at 2 minutes and counting, and we've got our takeaways. This is perfect, Kim. We did it.
We did it.
So some of our takeaways from today. So again, hard audit of your personal reading life and your classroom practices. Please use the resources in the slideshow and give us feedback on them and add to them. Again, all of this work is messy, but if we're in it together, it's more than manageable. And not to settle again for what's readily available, like to do the work of finding what's needed to meet our kids' needs. Leaning into our discomfort. I've been uncomfortable and, many times. And I think we have to lean into it and ask ourselves why. And
yes,
also,
and to that point, I'm going to jump in.
Go ahead.
We were talking about who discomfort for whom, because I think for underrepresented populations and people of color, this is our life. And so just because I'm not going to tell you that it's okay to be uncomfortable, because I think that is the work, but thinking about what does it mean when we say it's going to be hard or it's going to cause some discomfort. I think that that's necessary, particularly for people who sort of live in that reality every day.
Yeah. Yes. And again, it's one step at a time, because at least if you are changing your curriculum, you're changing your practices, one step is at least one step in the right direction. And to involve students. Again, that last note that we had about independent reading is about, handing it over. Like we talked today a lot about the choices we're making as teachers, but how can we model those choices and that thinking for students so that they can be making those choices themselves and giving you feedback, real-time feedback on how things are working.
That's right.
And then at the very end, we're going to tweet out this link to this slideshow so that you can have it. But at the very end here, I just want to explain, thank you very much. We are all works in progress. Please share how it's going. But at the very end, there's just like 2 additional things. I spent some time getting these images. Some podcasts that we both listen to, Teaching While White is excellent. Hidden Brain is the one we mentioned earlier. Jennifer Gonzalez of The Cult of Pedagogy. She has fantastic podcasts, but especially some of the episodes on culturally responsive teaching, how to support students of color, that I think was from last December, is excellent. Code Switch, great. Represent and Still Processing. Those 2 I listen to because I like hearing writers of color, journalists of color reacting to mainstream media and news and culture and hearing their takes. And of course, if you're not already familiar with Seeing White on Radio. And finally, Teaching Tolerance, shout out to them, Rethinking Schools, because they are excellent and wonderful. I'll stop sharing the screen so we can say goodbye to you in person if I can find my way back around here. Here we go. Okay. Yes. Yay.
See you later.
Always an honor to be able to tech host and then learn such great nuggets. And thank you for having this conversation, because while it may be difficult, it's one that's so needed. And, just checking in on our classroom libraries, and making sure it reflects our student body is so important. So thank you so much for the work. And I have to announce our next session. So I'm going to.
Yay! Thank you so much.
Hold on a second. Okay, so we have coming up next in session 3, Maggie Roberts, and she will be talking about the power of story, using writing as a way to form community, take risks, and help students to see themselves in our curriculum. We have Joseph Teague with workshop number 8, Golden Words and Golden Lines, adding vocabulary and author's craft study into independent reading and writing. And then I believe it's session 9, Aubrey Diorio and Caitlin McCummins, Innovate for Littles, using technology for inquiry-based learning. So take a break, take it all in, get on the Twitterverse, and come back and join us at 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. All right, bye.
See you later.